Thank God this incredible HFY masterpiece found you today. Witness the legend starting now. The Galactic Cooperative had spent approximately 7,000 years perfecting their species classification system, which was really just a fancy way of saying they had finally agreed on how to rank every sentient being in the known universe by how easily they could be killed. It was not the music, most diplomatic framework admittedly, but after the incident of the crystalline delegation, where a particularly enthusiastic handshake had literally shattered Ambassador Quelix into 17 pieces. Practicality had won over politeness. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Class 1 species hailed from garden worlds where evolution had been less of a brutal gladiatorial arena and more of a gentle suggestion. These beings required music, specific atmospheric compositions, precise temperature ranges, and absolutely no sudden movements. Music. Class 2 species were marginally hardier, capable of surviving minor fluctuations in their environment without immediately expiring. The classifications continued upward. And GT, music. And GT, each tier representing species who had evolved in progressively more hostile conditions. Then there were the Deathworlders. Class 9 and Class 10 music species came from planets that seemed to actively hate life, where survival was less of a given and more of a daily miracle. These worlds featured extreme gravity, violent weather patterns, aggressive megafauna, and ecosystems that operated music on the principle that everything wanted to kill everything else. Naturally, the Galactic Cooperative music kept a very careful distance from Deathworlders, who were regarded with the same mixture of awe and terror that one might reserve for an active volcano wearing a smile. Earth had been classified as a Class 10 music Deathworld within approximately 47 minutes of first contact. The human delegation had seemed confused. Music by this designation, which should have been the first warning sign. Any species that did not immediately music understand why their home world was considered a cosmic horror show was clearly suffering music from severe psychological damage. The humans had politely inquired about the classification criteria, listened to the exhaustive list of their planet's nightmarish qualities, and then responded with something that roughly translated to, "Huh, yeah, I guess it does rain a lot." This response had required 3 weeks of xenopsychological counseling for the evaluation committee. Despite Earth's terrifying classification, humans had been provisionally accepted into the Galactic Cooperative with one critical stipulation: limited interaction with Class 1 through Class 5 music species until proper safety protocols could be established. It was the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "Yes, you can join our club, but please stay in that corner and try not to breathe too loudly," which made the Galactic Music Youth Exchange Program's decision to accept a human student at Volturin Academy either remarkably progressive or catastrophically music stupid, depending on who you asked. Volturin Academy occupied a massive station in neutral space, a gleaming construct of silver and crystalline architecture that housed music, approximately 12,000 students from 73 different species. It was considered music, the pinnacle of civilized education, where the galaxy's brightest young minds gathered to learn music, advanced sciences, cultural diplomacy, and the art of not accidentally killing each other music through biological incompatibility. The station maintained a carefully controlled environment calibrated for Class 1 through Class 4 species. The atmosphere was a precise mixture of gases. The temperature held at a comfortable 22 degrees standard, and the gravity maintained at a gentle 0.7 music. Standard G. Everything was soft edges music and muted colors, designed for species whose evolutionary history had not included concepts like music, predation, or survival of the fittest. Into this delicate ecosystem, they had invited a human. The girl arrived on a Tuesday, which would later be remembered as either cosmically ironic or prophetically appropriate. She came through the docking bay with minimal luggage, wearing what the music intake coordinator's database identified as a school uniform from her home world. A dark blazer, a pleated skirt, knee-high socks, and a small backpack, decorated with colorful pins. She looked, by all available evidence, utterly harmless. This was the galaxy's first mistake. Music intake coordinator Jelisk, a centauran, whose species resembled what humans might describe as a floating jellyfish, made of lavender smoke, processed the human's arrival with professional efficiency tinged with barely concealed nervousness. The human had smiled during the intake process, which had exposed her teeth, bone-white calcium structures designed for tearing and grinding. Angelisk had required a moment to compose himself. "Welcome to Volturin Academy," Jelisk had said, his vocoder translating his chemical emissions into comprehensible language. "Your species designation has been noted, and we have prepared music appropriate accommodations. Please be aware that your physical capabilities may exceed those of your fellow students, and we ask that you exercise appropriate restraint." The human had nodded with what appeared to be genuine understanding, which was somehow more unsettling than if she music had argued. "Of course," she had said. "I will be super careful. I promise." The use of the word super had not been reassuring. The girl had been assigned to Residential Wing 7, a section populated primarily music by Class 2 and Class 3 species who were deemed sturdy enough to handle proximity to someone from a more robust music evolutionary background. Her roommate was a planarian named Music Vixery, whose species resembled a collection of floating geometric shapes held together by some force that physics could not adequately explain. Vixery had prepared extensively for the human's arrival, reading every available music file on Earth and its inhabitants. She considered herself intellectually ready for the experience. She was, it would turn out, catastrophically wrong. The first incident occurred music within 6 hours. Vixery had watched with increasing concern as the human unpacked her belongings. Music, which included several items that appeared designed for survival scenarios that should never occur in civilized space. A compressed sleeping bag rated for degrees, a multi-tool that included no fewer than 17 different blades, a container of something labeled emergency rations that, according to the translator, could sustain a human for up to 5. Music Days in hostile territory. Do you expect hostile territory at an educational institution? Vixery had asked, her geometric components rearranging themselves into a pattern that indicated polite confusion. The human had laughed, which was a sound that Vixery's species found deeply unsettling on a biological level. Oh no, these are just normal things I brought from home. You know, just in case. Just in case of what specifically? I don't know. Anything, I guess. This answer had music, not provided the comfort Vixery was seeking. The human had then proceeded to perform what she called her evening routine, which involved a series of physical exercises, music that defied Vixery's understanding of biology. The girl dropped to the floor, and GT, music, and GT, and executed 30 repetitions of an exercise called push-ups, which required her to lift her entire music body weight using only her arms. She followed this with something called sit-ups, and GT, music, and GT, then squats, then a stretching routine that suggested her skeletal structure was held together by rubber instead of proper bone. Is this necessary for your health? Vixery had asked, watching with a mixture music of horror and fascination. Not really, the human had replied, slightly out of breath. I just like to stay music in shape. Plus, I am on the track team back home, so I need to keep up my training. The concept of voluntarily engaging music, physical exertion beyond what was strictly necessary for survival, was so alien to Vixery that she required several minutes to process it. The human had then consumed approximately 1 L of water in a single continuous gulp, smiled music brightly, and announced she was going to take a shower with the water temperature set to as hot as possible. Vixery had immediately filed a wellness check with the residential advisor. By the end of the first week, the human had become something of a legend among the student body, though not in the way the exchange program coordinators had hoped. Stories circulated through the residential wings, each more alarming than the last, in all of them completely true. In Professor Kelman's introduction to organic chemistry music class, the human had accidentally knocked over a beaker containing a solution of diluted hydrochloric acid, while the other students had evacuated. In accordance with safety protocols, the human had simply grabbed the nearest absorption cloth and cleaned up the spill with her bare hands. When Professor Kelman and GT, music, and GT, a gaseous being who existed primarily as a sentient cloud, had frantically informed her that the acid could cause severe burns, the human had examined her hands with mild curiosity. Oh yeah, my skin is a little red, she had observed. I should probably wash this music off her. The concentration that would have permanently scarred most Class 1 through class music 4 species had caused her minor dermatological irritation. Professor Kelman had canceled the rest of that day's classes to reevaluate music, his career choices. Physical education had been similarly catastrophic. The class was designed music for species whose idea of exercise involved gentle floating or perhaps some light hovering. The human had arrived in specialized clothing called athletic wear and had proceeded music to treat the low-gravity gymnasium like her personal training facility. When the instructor, a Delphinian named Chorus, had suggested they music begin with a light warm-up jog, the human had nodded agreeably and started running, except her version of running involved moving at speeds that most species reserved for emergency evacuations. She had circled the gymnasium 17 times in the span of 3 minutes, her feet striking the padded floor with rhythmic impacts that sounded like a percussion instrument designed to intimidate prey. Chorus had watched with increasing alarm as the human's music body did things that should not be possible for any oxygen-breathing organism. Her skin had changed music color, shifting to a flushed pink as her internal temperature regulation system activated. She had begun secreting liquid through her skin, a waste elimination system that operated continuously during physical exertion. Her respiratory rate had increased, pulling in huge volumes of the station's carefully calibrated atmosphere, and she had music smiled the entire time, as if this was enjoyable. "Is the pace too slow?" she had asked when she finally stopped. And GT, music. And GT, barely winded. "I can go faster if you want." Chorus had needed music to sit down, which was particularly notable given that his species did not technically have the ability to sit. The cafeteria incident had become the stuff of station-wide legend. The human's dietary requirements were, to put it mildly, disturbing. She was an omnivore, which meant she could consume both plant and music animal matter, already a red flag for species who had evolved past such barbaric practices. But the specifics of what she ate had caused several students to question the fundamental fairness of evolution. On her third day, she had casually mentioned that her music favorite food was something called pizza, which apparently involved taking grain products, music, coating them with liquefied dairy proteins, adding processed plant matter, and then this was the part music that had caused residential advisor Flum to require medical attention, topping the entire music construction with preserved meat from an earth creature called a pig. "You consume the flesh of other organisms?" a crystalline student had asked. And GT, music. And GT, her prismatic structure flickering with distress. "Well, yeah," the human had replied, apparently confused by the question. "Humans are apex predators. We eat pretty much everything, music." The phrase apex predator had entered the station's rumor mill with the force of a small explosive device, but it was the human's music casual relationship with danger that truly set her apart from her fellow music students, things that would send Class 1 species into panic attacks barely registered on her threat assessment music scale, when a minor power fluctuation had caused the lights in corridor 9 to flicker. The human had simply pulled out a small music cylindrical device from her pocket that produced its own light. She had called it a flashlight and explained that she always carried one just in case. The concept of being prepared for infrastructure failure as a matter of routine had been genuinely incomprehensible to species whose stations had not music experienced a power failure in 600 years, when a fellow student had discovered what he believed was a dangerous creature in the common area, later identified as a completely harmless cleaning drone that had malfunctioned. The human had calmly approached it, diagnosed the problem, and fixed it. Using her multi-tool, she had then picked up the drone, music, which weighed approximately 15 kg, with one hand and returned it to the maintenance closet. It just needed a reboot, music, she had explained to the dozen students, who had evacuated to a safe music distance. No big deal. The casual application of problem-solving music skills and physical capability had been extremely big deal. By the second week, the human had acquired an entourage of students who followed her around with the dedication of religious pilgrims, though their motivations ranged from scientific curiosity to the kind of morbid fascination music one might have watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion. They cataloged her behaviors, recorded her statements, and tried music desperately to understand the psychology of a species that had evolved to find their nightmare homeworld perfectly acceptable. Professor Threnody, who taught comparative xenobiology, had made the human the subject of an entire lecture series. With the girls' permission, he had conducted a comprehensive biological scan, and the results had required him to update approximately music 40% of his course materials. The human skeletal structure was reinforced with a mineral compound that made it approximately 3 times denser than music comparable Class 1 species. Her muscular system operated on a ratio of strength to mass that seemed to violate several principles music of evolutionary efficiency. Her cardiovascular system could increase its performance by music up to 300% during stress responses, flooding her tissues music with oxygenated blood and triggering a cascade of chemical reactions that music temporarily enhanced her physical capabilities even further. Her immune system was a military-industrial complex operating inside her body, capable of identifying, targeting, and destroying thousands of different pathogens. She possessed redundant organs, a distributed nervous system that could continue functioning even music if parts of it were damaged, and a pain tolerance that Professor Threnody described as clinically concerning. Your species evolved to survive everything, Professor Threnody had said during one of their conversations. And GT, music. And GT, his chitinous exterior clicking with agitation. Your bodies are designed for a world that is actively trying to kill you at all times. The human music had considered this for a moment, then shrugged. I mean, Earth is not that bad. Sure, we have hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, droughts, music, floods, wildfires, and like a bunch of animals that can kill you. But you learn to deal with it. It is just home, you know. Professor Threnody had not known, and had spent the rest music of the day questioning his understanding of the word home. The turning point came during the 3rd week, when Station Director Valerix called in music emergency assembly to discuss developing situation. A solar flare from the nearby star was going to impact the station's shields, potentially causing fluctuations in the environmental systems. It was a minor issue, the sort of thing that happened once every few years, and the station systems were designed to compensate automatically. There may be some temporary variations in temperature, music, and atmospheric composition. Director Valerix announced, her scaled crest flattening with concern. We recommend all students remain in their quarters until the event passes. It should last no more than 6 hours. The student body music had received this news with appropriate levels of anxiety. Temperature variations could be dangerous for species with narrow environmental tolerances. Atmospheric changes could cause music respiratory distress. 6 hours was a long time to endure. Potentially music uncomfortable conditions. The human had raised her hand. Yes, Director Valerix had music said, recognizing her with some trepidation. What is the expected temperature range? Director Valerix consulted her data pad. We anticipate fluctuations between 18 and 28 degrees standard. Additionally, oxygen levels may vary between 19 and 23%, and humidity could increase by up to 15%. The human had nodded thoughtfully. Okay, so basically a normal spring day on Earth. Got it. The assembly hall music had gone completely silent. I am sorry, Director Valerix had said carefully. Did you say a normal spring day? Yeah, those are pretty standard conditions where I am from. Actually, it is a lot more stable than most days back music home. At least you know what is coming and can prepare for it. The implication that Earth's normal music, unpredictable weather was worse than what the station considered an emergency, had required music several minutes of stunned silence to process. When the solar flare hit the station, system's music performed exactly as predicted. The temperature climbed to 27 degrees in some sections. Music dropped to 18 in others. The atmospheric processors struggled to maintain consistent oxygen levels. Humidity spiked, causing condensation on some of the cooler music surfaces. For most of the student body, it was a miserable 6 hours spent in music, their quarters, managing mild discomfort and complaining to each other through the station's communication network. The human had gone for a jog. Vixery had watched in disbelief as her roommate laced music up her running shoes, a concept that still baffled her, as most species did not require specialized equipment for the basic music act of locomotion, and announced she was going to take advantage of the humidity to get some good cardio in. The environmental conditions are outside safe parameters. Music, Vixery had protested weakly. For you, maybe. The human had replied, music cheerfully. For me, this is great training weather. Back home, I used to run in way worse conditions. One time, I did a 5 km race in the rain when it was like 12 degrees. Music, this is basically perfect. She had left the room at music, a light jog, her footfalls echoing down the corridor with metronomic precision. Within 20 minutes, reports had started flooding into the station's emergency response network. A human student was running through the corridors. She appeared to be exercising voluntarily. She was sweating profusely but seemed to be enjoying herself. She had smiled and waved at several students who had peered out of their quarters with mounting alarm. Director Valerix had personally intercepted the human in corridor 12, materializing in her path with what she hoped was authoritative music. Present student, She had said firmly, "You should be in your quarters. The environmental music conditions are not stable." The human had stopped jogging, though she continued bouncing slightly on her feet in a way music that suggested her body was not ready to cease physical activity. "Oh, hey, Director Valorex, sorry I did not realize I was not supposed to be out here. I thought the recommendation was just for people who were uncomfortable with the conditions." "You are not uncomfortable." "Not really. I mean, it is a little warm, but nothing too bad. Kind of reminds me of summer back home." Director Valorex had stared at this small being, this child really, who was standing in environmental conditions that were causing most of her music students' genuine distress, and had an epiphany that was equal parts revelation and existential horror. Humans did not have a safety range. They had a preference range, music. Certainly a zone of optimal comfort. But their actual survival parameters were so broad that what other species considered dangerous was to them merely inconvenient. "Tell me," Director Valorex had said slowly, "what environmental conditions would you consider dangerous?" The human music had thought about this with an expression of genuine concentration. "I mean, if it gets below freezing music or above like 40 degrees, that starts to get pretty uncomfortable. And if the oxygen drops below 15% or goes above 25% music, that would be a problem. Oh, and if the humidity gets above 90% or drops below 10%, that can cause some issues." Director Valorex had calculated those parameters against her own species' survival range. The humans' acceptable conditions covered a span that included 5 different climate classifications and would be immediately music lethal to approximately 60% of the station's population. "I see," she had said faintly. "Please return to your quarters anyway, for my peace music of mind if nothing else." The human had agreed with good-natured compliance, though she had mentioned something about finishing her cool down. That suggested she did not entirely understand the concept music of immediate compliance. That evening, Director Valorex had done something she had not done in her 30 years of station administration. She had accessed Earth's environmental database and actually read the detailed specifications. Music. Earth's atmosphere was 21% oxygen, which would cause hyperoxia and potential cellular damage in most music Class 1 species. Its gravity was 1 standard G, which would crush the skeletal structures of anyone not evolved for such conditions. Its temperature music ranges varied wildly depending on location and season, from degrees in some regions to plus 50 degrees in others. The planet was 70% covered in music, a liquid that most species considered a universal solvent and would require specialized equipment to survive in. The remaining 30% featured every possible terrain type, from frozen wastelands to arid deserts, to dense jungles, music filled with organisms that competed for resources with ultraviolet efficiency. Earth experienced music, regular, catastrophic weather events, hurricanes with wind speeds exceeding 300 km/h, tornadoes, music that could level entire settlements, electrical storms that discharged music, billions of joules of energy and temperature fluctuations. And GT, music. And GT, that could span 30 degrees in a single day. And humans just lived there. They built their homes and raised their children, and went about music, their daily lives, on a planet that was actively hostile to biological existence. Director Valorex had closed the database and sat in silence for approximately 20 minutes, contemplating the implications. The next day she had called an assembly, specifically for the teaching staff. We need to discuss the human student. She had begun music without preamble. Has she done something wrong? Professor Kelman had asked, his gaseous form flickering with concern. No. That is precisely the problem. She has done everything right according to human standards, which means she has been casually demonstrating capabilities that make most of our students question the fundamental fairness of evolution. Professor Threnody had clicked his mandibles music in agreement. I have been conducting ongoing observations. The human female operates at what she describes as normal capacity within her species music baseline parameters. She has not yet demonstrated any of the enhanced music capabilities that humans are capable of during stress responses. Enhanced music capabilities. Another professor had asked weakly. Under duress music, humans can access something they call adrenaline responses. Professor Threnody music had explained. Their strength can increase by up to 40%. Their pain perception decreases, their reaction times improve, and they enter music, a state of heightened awareness that prioritizes survival over virtually all considerations. There are documented cases of humans lifting objects several times their body weight, running at speeds that should tear their muscles, and continuing to function despite music injuries that would be immediately fatal to most species. The staff had absorbed music, this information, with the enthusiasm of people being told their retirement savings had been invested in a black hole. So what you are telling, Director Valoric's music had said slowly, is that the human we have on this station, who has already demonstrated alarming capabilities, is currently music operating at her casual baseline and could theoretically become significantly music more formidable if she perceived a threat. Correct. Director Valorix had made a decision that would later be studied in xenodiplomatic courses as either brilliant or insane. Then we need to ensure she never perceives a threat while on this station. More importantly, we need to stop treating her like she is fragile and start music recognizing that she is probably the most capable organism on this entire facility. The staff had spent the next hour discussing how to implement this philosophical shift while simultaneously music dealing with the psychological impact of realizing that their safety protocols were designed for protecting students' music from the environment, when they should have been considering how to protect the environment from the student. The human, blissfully unaware of these music administrative discussions, continued her daily routine with the same cheerful obliviousness that had characterized her time on the station. She attended her classes, completed her assignments, exercised religiously, and maintained her social connections with a genuine warmth that made it difficult to remember she was a walking biological weapon system. Her fellow students had gradually adjusted to her music presence, moving from terror to fascination to a kind of resigned acceptance. The human was strange, yes, and her capabilities were unsettling. Music, certainly, but she was also unfailingly kind. Remarkably music, patient with questions about her species, and possessed a sense of humor that translated surprisingly music, well, across species barriers. During a study session in the common area, a Centauran student named Music Flizzic had finally asked the question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Does it not bother you," he had said carefully, "that your home world is so dangerous, that your species had to evolve so many survival mechanisms just to exist?" The human had Music looked up from her data pad, considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness, and then smiled. "I guess I never really thought about it that way. I mean, yeah, Earth can be dangerous, but it is also beautiful. We have these things Music called sunsets, where the light from our star hits the atmosphere at an angle and creates all these colors across the sky. We have oceans that are so vast you cannot see the other side, and mountains that take days to climb, and forests that have been growing for thousands of years." She had paused, her expression growing distant with memory. "And yeah, sometimes there are hurricanes or earthquakes or whatever, but that is just music, part of living on a planet that is alive, you know. Everything on Earth is connected, the weather, the animals, the plants, and GT, music, and GT, the geology. It all fits together into this big, complicated, beautiful system. But surely you wish it was safer?" Another student had Music asked. The human had laughed. "I mean, safer would be nice, I guess. But if Earth was safer, we would not be who Music we are. Humans are adaptable because we had to be. We are strong because our environment demanded it. We are creative because we had to find solutions to impossible music problems. Our entire history is basically just a story of refusing to let our planet kill us, and eventually figuring out how to music thrive anyway." She had shrugged, returning to her data pad. "Besides, I kind of like music, knowing that I come from a place that made me tough. It is something to be proud of, you know." The study group Music had sat in silence, processing this perspective. To come from Music, a world that was actively hostile, and to feel pride rather than resentment was so fundamentally Music alien to their experience that it required a complete recontextualization Music of their understanding of survival. Later that week, a minor incident had occurred that cemented the humans' reputation on the station forever. Music, a maintenance drone had malfunctioned in one of the storage bays, creating a small electrical fire. The automated suppression systems had engaged immediately, Music, but a section of storage racks had partially collapsed, trapping 2 students, a Delphinian and a Crystalline, behind a barrier of fallen equipment. The station's emergency response team had been alerted, but they were delayed by a training exercise Music in another section of the facility. Estimated response time was 8 minutes. The human had been passing by when she heard the distress calls. What happened next would be reviewed by the station security systems. approximately 400 times in the following week, each viewing generating more questions than answers. The human had assessed the situation with a speed that suggested her threat. Evaluation systems operated at a fundamentally different processing rate than most species. She had noted the fire already being suppressed by automated systems, the fallen equipment, the trapped students, and the lack of immediate response personnel. Then she had simply walked into the storage bay and started moving the equipment. The fallen storage racks were modular units, each weighing approximately 80 kg, and designed to be moved only with mechanical assistance. The human had grabbed the first music rack, her muscles visibly tensing beneath her skin, and lifted it enough to shift it aside. Then the second, then the third. By the time the emergency response team arrived, she had cleared a path to the trapped students and was helping them out of the debris field, asking the music if they were injured with a calm efficiency of someone conducting a routine safety music check. The response team's leader, a Tharvian named Calxus, whose species resembled an ambulatory plant system, had stared at the scene with disbelief. "Did you move all of this yourself?" he had asked. The human had looked at music, the displaced equipment, as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh yeah. It was not that heavy, and the students needed help. Was I not supposed to do that? Each of those racks weighs 80 kg. Music? Yeah, I could tell. I used to help my dad move furniture back home, so I know how to lift properly. You just need to bend your knees and use your core strength." The concept of furniture moving as a casual domestic music activity that required moving objects weighing 80 kg had caused Calx's music to reevaluate several assumptions about civilized living. News of the incident had spread through music, the student body with the speed of light traveling through a vacuum. The human had moved equipment music that should have required mechanical assistance. She had done it calmly, efficiently, and without apparent music strain. She had put herself at potential risk to help others. She was, in short, exactly the kind of person the galactic cooperative had been trying to cultivate for 7,000 years. Except she came from a death world and apparently considered all of this completely music, normal behavior. Director Valerix had called the human to her office the next day, ostensibly to discuss the incident. In reality, she wanted to understand what motivated a being who could casually perform feats of strength to risk herself music for others. "Why did you enter the storage bay?" Director Valerix Music had asked. "You could have waited for the emergency response team." The human had seemed genuinely confused by the question. "Because waiting would have taken 8 minutes and I was right music there. It seemed like the obvious choice. You did not consider the potential danger. I mean, the fire was already being put out and the equipment was not that music unstable. It was just heavy. And someone needed help. That is all. Someone needed help, so you helped them." The human had nodded. "Yeah, pretty much. That is kind of a basic thing where music I come from. If you can help and you do not, that is considered music really bad." Director Valerix had studied this young being, this product of a nightmare world who had been shaped by brutality into something unexpectedly noble, music, and had finally understood what made humans truly dangerous. It was not their strength, though they were music undeniably strong. It was not their resilience, though they could survive conditions that would kill most species. It was not even music, their adaptability, though they could thrive in environments ranging from Arctic tundra to desert wastelands. It was their baseline assumption that music helping others was the default choice, that risking yourself for someone else was not heroism, but basic decency, that cooperation was not a political strategy, but a fundamental moral obligation. Humans had evolved on a world that tried to music kill them constantly, and their response had been to build societies based on mutual aid and collective survival. They had looked at a planet full of hazards and decided that the biggest threat was not the environment, but the possibility of facing it alone. "You are a remarkable individual," Director Valorax had said finally. The human had blushed, her skin shifting to a darker shade in what appeared to be an embarrassment response. "I really just did what anyone would do." "No," Director Valorax had corrected gently. "You did what any human would do. That is what makes you remarkable." The remainder of the academic term had proceeded with a new understanding, permeating the station's social dynamics. The human was no longer viewed as a dangerous anomaly, but as a representative of a species whose capabilities were music matched by their compassion. Students who had initially avoided her began seeking her out. And GT, music. And GT, asking questions about Earth, about human culture, about what it meant to come from a place where survival required constant vigilance and cooperation. The human had answered every question. Music, with patience and humor, describing her home world with the affection of someone talking about a difficult music, but beloved family member. She told stories about Earth seasons, music, its diverse ecosystems, its staggering variety of life forms. She explained music, human customs, human history, human art and music and literature. And gradually, the students of Voltorian music did not just produce survivors. They produced survivors who valued life, precisely because they understood how music, fragile and precious it was. On the last day of the term, Professor Threnody had given a final lecture on comparative xenobiology that had deviated significantly from the approved curriculum. Music. "We began this course," he had said, "with the assumption that classification systems music define species, that Class 1 organisms are fundamentally different from Class 10 organisms, not just in capability, but in nature." He had paused, his chitinous exterior clicking thoughtfully. This was incorrect. The lecture hall had erupted in confused murmurs. "The human student music among us," Professor Threnody had continued, "has demonstrated that classification describes environmental adaptation, not moral character. Her species evolved to survive a hostile world, yes. They developed remarkable physical capabilities, certainly, but they also developed societies built on cooperation, art that celebrates beauty, and philosophies that value kindness." He had looked directly at the human, who was sitting in her usual seat near the front, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. You have taught us that strength music, without compassion, is merely survival, but compassion born from strength is civilization. The human had raised her hand. Tentatively, I just want to say that I am really not that special. Most humans are way more capable than me. I am literally just music, a student who runs track and likes pizza. The fact that she genuinely believed this, that she could not see how music, extraordinary she was by galactic standards, had somehow made Professor Threnodies point even more effectively than any argument he could have made. As the term ended and students departed for their respective home music worlds, the human had said her goodbyes with the same cheerful optimism music she had displayed upon arrival. She had hugged students whose biology made such physical contact mildly terrifying, promised to stay in touch via the galactic communication network, and expressed genuine music excitement about returning to Earth. I have missed the weather, she had said to Vixery during their final music conversation as roommates. I know that sounds weird, but there is something about rain that just feels like music home, you know. Vixery, who had spent months studying her roommate with the dedication of a scientist observing a new phenomenon, had finally understood. You miss the chaos because the chaos shaped you. The human had music grinned. Yeah, exactly, you get it. As the transport ship carrying the music human student departed from the station, Director Valorax had stood in the observation deck watching it disappear. Music into the distance. Beside her, Professor Threnody maintained music, his usual contemplative posture. Do you think she knows? The professor had asked. How much she changed this place? I doubt it. Director Valorax had replied. Humans rarely recognize their own impact. It is one of their more endearing qualities, and also one of their most dangerous. True, they had stood in silence, considering the implications of a species that could reshape perspectives simply by being themselves. The Galactic Cooperative had spent 7,000 years building elaborate classification systems, creating safety protocols, and maintaining careful boundaries between species of different durability classes. And a single human student, just by showing up and being helpful music, had demonstrated that perhaps they had been measuring the wrong things all along. The reports from Voltorian Academy would eventually reach the higher councils of the Galactic Cooperative, sparking debates about human integration, safety, protocols, music, and the philosophical implications of Deathworld species in civilized society. Committees would form, and GT music, and GT recommendations would be drafted, and policies would be revised. But none of that music mattered to the human girl on the transport ship heading back to Earth. She was probably already planning her next track music season, thinking about what food she would eat when she got home, and looking forward to music telling her friends about her semester in space. She would describe the experience as pretty cool and really interesting music, and her friends would nod and ask if the food was any good, and she would laugh music and say, not really, but I survived. And none of them music would understand how that single sentence, I survived, contained within it, and GT music, and GT and GT, the entire philosophy of a species that had looked at an impossible world and decided to thrive anyway. Somewhere on Voltorian Academy, a Class 1 student would look up at the stars and think about music. The human, who had moved 80 kg equipment like it was furniture, who had jogged during an environmental emergency like it was a pleasant spring day, who had smiled with her predator teeth and been kind anyway. And they would wonder, with the kind of existential uncertainty that comes from having your world view fundamentally music altered what else they had gotten wrong about the galaxy. The answer, of course, was everything. But that was okay. Humans had been getting things wrong for their entire evolutionary history, and it had never stopped them from figuring it out eventually. That, more than anything else, was what made them truly dangerous. Not that they were strong, but that they never stopped music trying to be better